There is a grain that survives droughts that kill every other crop around it. It grows in hot, dry soil where rice and wheat simply give up. It has fed people for over 8,000 years. And then a wave of high-yielding modern crops swept across the world and pushed it almost completely out of memory. Stay with me. It is called sorghum. You have probably seen the word on a bag of gluten-free flour or heard it mentioned as livestock feed and moved on without a second thought. Most people in the modern West have never once eaten it on purpose. But for thousands of years, across enormous stretches of the planet, sorghum was not a side note. It was survival. It fed entire regions through droughts that historians can still trace in the agricultural record of 3 different continents. Picture a field in central India. In a year, the monsoon fails. The rice paddies nearby have already cracked into dry mud, the stalks brown and dead before they ever filled out a single grain. The jowar field next to them is still standing, not lush, not thriving, but alive, producing, feeding the family that planted it. That image repeated itself across thousands of harvests in thousands of villages on 3 continents. For thousands of years, which is exactly why a plant most Westerners cannot identify on sight, was once one of the most trusted crops on Earth. Grown not because anyone studied it in a laboratory, but because generation after generation watched it survive the exact conditions that destroyed everything around it. 8,000 years ago, in the grasslands of what is now Sudan, people discovered a tough wild grass that could grow where almost nothing else could in punishing heat, in poor soil. In conditions that would wither most food crops within weeks, they began cultivating it, selecting the strongest plants season after season, and over generations turned a wild grass into one of the most reliable food crops human beings have ever grown. What made early farmers fall in love with it was simple. It survived when everything else died, even during the worst droughts. Sorghum plants would still produce grain that a family could harvest and eat, while crops around them failed completely. That single property made it priceless to communities living at the edge of what the land could support. It did not stay in one place. Arab traders carried sorghum into India and China roughly 3,000 years ago, moving along the same trade routes that carried spices, textiles, and ideas across the ancient world. In India, it became known as jowar, and it grew into a foundational crop in the driest regions of the subcontinent, Rajasthan, Maharashtra, places where rainfall could never be counted on and where a failed monsoon could mean the difference between a fed village and a starving one. It spread south and west across Africa under dozens of local names, different communities, different languages, different climates, all independently arriving at the same conclusion about the same plant. It spread because it worked, carried by ordinary farmers who refused to leave behind a crop that had never once failed them when they needed it most. Packed into the same sacks as their seed grain for the next season's planting, trusted enough to be worth the wait on a long journey when every pound carried mattered. Hold on to that fact, because it explains everything that happens later in this story. A crop that keeps working when every other crop fails is not a convenience. It is insurance. And insurance only matters to the people who remember what it feels like to need it. Sorghum uses what botanists call the C4 photosynthetic pathway, a more efficient way of converting sunlight into usable energy than the C3 pathway most plants, including wheat and rice, rely on. It needs less water and less nitrogen to produce the same amount of food energy, and it keeps photosynthesizing efficiently in heat that shuts other plants down completely. It can mature quickly enough to provide more than one harvest in a single year in the right climate. And it tolerates waterlogging when the rain finally does come, which most drought-tolerant crops cannot manage at all. Compare that to what a rice paddy actually requires. Rice is, for most of its growing cycle, deliberately flooded fields submerged under standing water that has to be managed and maintained throughout the season. Wheat needs a less extreme but still reliable rainfall pattern, enough consistent moisture that a serious drought at the wrong moment can wipe out an entire harvest. Sorghum needs neither. Its root system reaches deeper into the soil than most cereal crops, drawing on moisture other plants cannot access, and a waxy coating on its leaves reduces water loss even under direct, punishing sun. And it does something almost no other major grain bothers to do. Sorghum actively defends itself against weeds, releasing a compound called sorgoleone directly from its roots into the surrounding soil. suppressing competing growth nearby before it ever has a chance to crowd out the young sorghum plants. For a farmer, with no money for herbicide and no machinery to clear weeds mechanically, that single trait can decide whether a field produces a harvest at all, especially in regions where hand-weeding an entire planting season is simply not a realistic option for a family working the land alone. The plant gives more than grain to across the regions where it has been grown longest. Almost nothing about sorghum goes to waste. The grain is ground into flour for flatbreads and porridges, fermented into traditional beers and drinks across parts of Africa and Asia, and in some varieties pressed for a sweet syrup similar to molasses. The stalks and leaves, after the grain is harvested, become feed for livestock, ensuring the same single planting supports both the family and the animals that family depends on. Even the dry stalks left over after threshing have traditionally been used for fencing, thatching, and fuel in communities where nothing useful is allowed to go to waste. A crop this complete, asking this little and returning this much, is not the kind of thing agricultural history usually discards by accident. Today, sorghum still ranks as the world's fifth most important cereal crop, grown across Africa, Central America, and South Asia, often by smallholder farmers with no access to fertilizer, no irrigation, and no safety net if a harvest fails. Across the African continent, it remains one of the top staple foods by total production volume, standing alongside cassava, maize, and yams as a crop entire national food systems still genuinely depend on, even as global attention drifted elsewhere decades ago. Major producers today include the United States, Nigeria, India, and Mexico, a spread that tells its own story. A crop trusted on 4 different continents by people who have never met and never needed to, because the plant itself made the case. So here is the question. If sorghum is this resilient, this proven, this trusted across 8,000 years and 4 continents, why have most people in wealthy countries never eaten it, never grown it, and barely recognized the name? There is nothing wrong with what is actually in the grain. Sorghum is naturally gluten-free, which matters enormously to the growing number of people managing celiac disease or gluten sensitivity. It carries a respectable protein content for a cereal grain, along with meaningful amounts of fiber, iron, and B vitamins. Certain varieties, particularly darker-colored sorghum, contain high concentrations of antioxidant compounds called tannins and anthocyanins. The same broad family of protective plant compounds researchers prize in foods like berries and red wine. None of this is a new discovery, dressed up to sound impressive. It is simply what has always been inside a grain that fed civilizations for 8,000 years, sitting unexamined by most of the modern nutrition conversation because the grain itself had quietly fallen out of the conversation entirely. So, if the science checks out and the history checks out, the answer has to be sitting somewhere else entirely. Keep that question open for a moment, because the real explanation is not about the plant at all. It is about a decision made by people who were never thinking about sorghum specifically when they made it. In the middle of the 20th century, the Green Revolution swept across the global food system. Scientists spread new high-yielding varieties of wheat and rice, crops designed to produce dramatically more grain per acre, provided they were given the fertilizer, irrigation, and pesticide inputs. The new varieties depended on where those inputs were available. Yields exploded. Famine-prone regions saw harvests multiply. Millions of lives were saved by exactly this shift, and that fact does not need defending here. It is simply true. The scientists who developed those varieties were responding to a real and urgent crisis: population growth outpacing food production, famine, a genuine and present danger across large parts of the world. The new wheat and rice varieties were a legitimate, life-saving achievement. None of what follows erases that. But here's what happened next, and this is the part that gets left out. As wheat and rice climbed to dominance under the new high-input model, global agricultural policy, research funding, and trade systems rebuilt themselves almost entirely around 2 crops. Subsidies flowed toward wheat and rice. Research budgets followed the same 2 crops. University programs, government grants, international development funding, all gravitating toward the grains that had already proven they could deliver dramatic yield numbers under controlled conditions. International food aid programs standardized around wheat and rice as the default grains to ship into food-insecure regions. Regardless of whether those regions had any tradition of eating either one, meaning a community in West Africa that had grown. Sorghum for thousands of years might receive emergency food aid in the form of imported wheat flour. A grain its own soil and climate were never built to produce. Arriving in sacks stamped with the logo of a foreign aid agency instead of a crop, the local farmers already knew how to grow themselves. Production and consumption of resilient grains like sorghum declined steadily for decades, not because sorghum failed at anything, but because an entire global system had been rebuilt around two specific crops and simply stopped investing in the alternative. Watch what that decision actually cost, because the bill came due in real harvests, in real years. In real families who had no say in the policy meetings where wheat and rice became the default and sorghum quietly became an afterthought. In Senegal, farmers gradually abandoned traditional sorghum in favor of imported rice, following the same broader shift happening across the developing world. Rice was the modern choice, the convenient choice, the grain associated with progress rather than the harder, older way of farming. Then rice prices spiked on the global market, and severe droughts hit the region at the same time, a double blow that arrived without warning. Rural families who had switched away from sorghum found themselves caught between an expensive imported staple they could no longer easily afford and a climate that no longer cooperated with the crop they had replaced it with. Communities that had kept planting traditional sorghum varieties, or that returned to them once the crisis hit, were measurably more food secure than their rice-dependent neighbors, because the crop their grandparents had relied on was still doing exactly what it had always done. It had only stopped being the default choice. That is, the cost of optimizing one crop for perfect conditions while letting the backup crop for bad conditions quietly disappear from the fields. A field planted entirely with one high-yield variety produces an extraordinary harvest in a good year and very little in a bad one. A field that kept its drought-tolerant insurance crop in rotation never had quite the same spectacular peak, but it also never faced the same catastrophic collapse when the rains failed to arrive on schedule. Sorghum was that insurance, built directly into how entire regions fed themselves for as long as anyone could remember, until the global food system stopped treating it as worth maintaining, and an entire generation of farmers grew up planting whatever the subsidy programs and the export markets rewarded instead of whatever the local climate actually demanded. The same pressure that drove sorghum's importance in Africa for 8,000 years is now showing up in places that never used to think about drought-resistant grain at all. Farmers across the American Midwest and Great Plains, regions built almost entirely around corn and soybeans, are increasingly experimenting with sorghum and other millets, specifically because they tolerate the extreme heat and drought. Recent growing seasons have brought these farmers can typically run the same equipment they already own for corn and soybeans, which lowers the barrier to trying something different without requiring an entirely new investment in machinery. Farmers in Queensland, Australia, have turned the country into one of the world's largest sorghum exporters, specifically because it handles heat and dry conditions that wheat increasingly cannot. A farmer outside Arnett, Oklahoma, planted proso millet, expecting it to burn up alongside his wheat crop during a brutal drought. It did not. He harvested and sold it while his wheat failed in the same field. In the same season, under the same sky. That is not a story passed down from a grandparent. That happened in the last few years to a farmer making a real decision with real money on the line. These are not isolated anecdotes from people chasing novelty. They are early signs of a genuine practical shift, driven by farmers who do not have the luxury of sentiment about which crop is fashionable. When a field of wheat burns up and a field of millet next to it survives, that distinction gets noticed immediately, remembered, and acted on the following season, regardless of what the rest of the agricultural industry has spent decades promoting. And there is a quiet shift happening at the grocery store, too. In the United States, sorghum sales for human food, not livestock feed, have grown roughly 300% over the past decade, driven by demand for gluten-free grains. It is naturally gluten-free, nutrient-dense, and increasingly available as flour, as a rice alternative, even popped like popcorn. Bakers have started working sorghum flour into bread recipes specifically for its mild, slightly sweet flavor. A welcome change from the often gritty or bland profile that gives some gluten-free flours their poor reputation. The grain never stopped being good. The market is only now starting to remember that. Sorghum is still growing in hot, dry soil across multiple continents right now, doing precisely what it has always done, indifferent to whether anyone is paying attention. It needs no special miracle to work. It never did. It just needs the same thing it has needed since a handful of farmers in ancient Sudan. First, notice that this one tough grass kept producing food when everything around it had already died. The 8,000 years did not require a marketing budget. The droughts it survived were not laboratory tests. They were real seasons, real failed neighboring crops, real families who depended on a harvest coming in when nothing else around them would survive long enough to be worth harvesting at all. No company owns the patent on sorghum. No single nation can claim it invented the crop. It belongs to everyone who ever planted it and trusted it, which is exactly why no marketing department was ever assigned to remind the rest of the world it existed. That kind of track record does not need anyone's permission to matter again. The next drought, the next failed rice harvest, the next farmer standing in a dead wheat field, looking at the millet still standing beside it, will make the case all over again the same way it always has. With or without anyone watching, with or without a single dollar of marketing behind it. 8,000 years of being right has a way of outlasting a few decades of being ignored. The grain does not need a rebrand, a marketing campaign, or anyone's apology. It only needs farmers willing to plant it again, and increasingly, faced with a climate that no longer guarantees the conditions wheat and rice were built around, more of them are doing exactly that. If this vault opens something for you, subscribe and hit the bell. Every like and every share preserves what they tried to erase. The next vault opens soon.